She twines her spines up slowly towards the voice. And when I touched her skin, my fingers ran with blood.
I want you to stop saying odd shit like you smell a psychosphere or you're in someone's faded memory of a town. Just stop.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to No Way Jose. Today I am joined by Stephen DeLay, and we are doing a True Detective Season 1 analysis. I've been looking forward to doing this for quite a long time. I was blown away when I first watched that first season, and I don't know if I'll necessarily ever watch any of the other seasons from what I've heard of reviews of them, which I don't know, maybe we'll have a little side discussion on that. I'm not worried about, though. I'm not a huge cinema guy, so it's not like something I need in my life, but season 1 definitely was a pretty mind-blowing experience. I would recommend it for most people, and we'll get into that today, the reasons why, and why it's such a great masterpiece, in my opinion. But before we get into that, before we bring on our guests, I do want to remind you guys that today's episode was brought to you by Nado Shave Co. If you're tired of that razor burn irritation, those ingrown hairs from those multi-blade cartridges, then this is the way to go. You can shave just like your grandpa used to, whether you're shaving your whole face or edging your beard. The single blades give you a barber-grade shave for a fraction of the price. The standard issue is $75, and it comes with 100 stainless steel razor blades. That's supposed to last you a year. It's probably going to last you a lot longer, but if you're someone who shaves on the daily or every other day or so, you're going to want to consider the Quarter Shave Club. That's going to put you about 25 cents per replacement blade. Now let's recap this real quick. This is a superior shaving product in the sense that it is better for your skin. It is a better shave. It is a cheaper product, and it is from a company that doesn't hate your guts. This is a COVID mandate refusing company. It was born out of refusing the COVID mandate. And on top of all that, you can use code Jose for 10% off your order. Let them know I sent you. With that, let's get into the show. Let's get Steven on here and get into some True Detective analysis. What is up, Steven? How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Glad to have you here. Been looking forward to this. We've been probably at least a month ago we talked and we kicked around this idea. I think you'd seen one of my appearances or something and just kind of naturally fell together that I don't know if you'd heard me talk about True Detective or what, but you've done this before. This is kind of your thing. You seem to. I mean, this is a cultural milieu is your thing, is analyzing that. So I guess kind of let people know who you are, what you're about. So my audience get a feel for you before we get into today's episode.
Yeah, well, I learned of your show through your appearance on Sam Tripoli's podcast, and I immediately recognized that you're interested in a lot of the work that I've been interested in for a number of years as well. I'm a writer and a philosopher, so some of the work I do is academic, scholarly, philosophical work, particularly, excuse me, in a field of philosophy called phenomenology and existentialism. And I'm also a fiction writer. And then at the same time, I'm also interested in film studies and film phenomenology. But more particularly, I'm interested in cultural engineering studies and how cinema and television can be used as, well, in effect, weapons of psychological warfare. And at the moment, I have an interest particularly in the genre of film noir. So I've been working on a noir book, and I've recently written on Chinatown for a publication called Cultural Engineering Studies, which is founded by the guys that do PSYOP Cinema. And so I've had noir on my mind for a while, and we recently did an episode on True Detective last year. And so I really just jumped at the chance to be here with you tonight to talk more about True Detective.
Well, I'm glad to have you here. This is something that I've been itching at. I mean, literally I see it in almost everything I do now, especially given the realm, the area that I dig into, the parapolitical, the Dutros, the Finders, the all these awful cases. I get drawn to them. I very much identify with Rusty Cohle when he says, I won't look away again. I know there's something to that. There's a great message to this movie. I mean, then you have the inverse of that, which is Marty, who kind of his whole shtick is he doesn't want to look. Like, he's kind of the average, well-meaning person that just wants to pretend there isn't this evil side of the world. And I don't know. I think that's part of why this show had such a big impact on me, because I'd already been so I just came across the show like in the past year. But I'd been already so inundated in the parapolitical world, like I've Oklahoma City bomb, like I just studied so much of this shit now that like, and then I came across this, and then it just it was so far advanced revelation and method wise as compared to like other things that I had seen. And then I come to find out that it's actually been out for a decent amount of time. And I believe it happened before really. I mean, I know people will say like, things like Epstein were talked about before, like on Alex Jones, prior to this, around this time. But it was like, culturally speaking, it was a non existent thing. Like, people didn't know about him. So at the time when this came out, like, yes, I guess sure, if you were super duper into the know, maybe you would know these sort of things. But for the most part, it was nowhere near what it is today, the level of like cultural understanding of these sorts of things. And this is when it came out. And I was astounded the level of like, holy shit, this is so many parallels to the things I study. Like I was already astounded by that watching it in 2024. So and it's been out for I believe over somewhere in the realm of like a decade. So I guess I'd kind of like to hear about your initial experience with the show. Where were you in your journey, parapolitically or conspiracy wise or whatever? Was this something that you picked up on that? Because I guess a lot of people don't pick up on that, and so I think maybe they're missing maybe it doesn't speak to them as deeply as it does other people who are kind of interested in that stuff. But I mean, even then, I watched with my wife, who's kind of a little bit more normie, and she still liked it. She wasn't like blown away. Clearly, like I was like damn near crying by the end of the first season. Like it was beautiful. So I guess I pass it off to you. Just your thoughts. I mean, I'm kind of pregnant with thoughts when it comes to this show.
Well, this season is in a way the holy grail for conspiracy researchers, isn't it? Because in a way, it confirms one of the fundamental theses that those who work in parapolitical research and conspiracy research for so long have talked about, which is the expression you just mentioned in passing, namely revelation of the method. And the idea that a number of researchers have had really now for many decades is that in cinema and in television and other art, the occult and the people who really run the world will expose the public to secrets about the criminal underworld and the world of blackmail and extortion, and in the case of what's shown in True Detective, the ritualistic abuse and torture and murder of children. And of course, there's a question about why it is that they would reveal these things, and that's a question that I think we can turn to at the very end of the discussion once we sort of work through what's in the show and the parallels between what's shown in the season and a number of real life cases. You mentioned some of them already: the Finders, the Franklin cover up, the Presidio, McMartin preschool, and then of course more recently Pizzagate and Epstein, and then also Jerry Sandusky situation in Penn State. For me personally, the show immediately gripped me because when it was released in 2014, I was already really down the rabbit hole with conspiracies. So like back in college and in the aughts, like in 2005, I figured out about 9/11 being an inside job, and I was watching InfoWars, so I learned about Bohemian Grove and Moloch, and so I was aware of VIP pedophile rings and that kind of activity. What I didn't understand until later was that it's actually much more pervasive, and of course, it's not something that's relegated only to these really truly powerful elite circles. It's really something that has saturated really all dimensions of society, all social classes, and that's something I think comes out in season one, is that you see that this network or this ring really goes from like all the way down to like what we call like trailer trash, all the way up to the governor of Louisiana. And then of course, as we know from doing research into other cases, it's not even just something that occurs in a place like Louisiana, but it happens in Washington, D.C. It happens in Los Angeles. It happens in New York. It happens in the United Kingdom, in London, and it happens in Europe. It happens everywhere. So when I saw the show initially in 2014, I was blown away, and I wondered, well, how was the show even made? Because one thing to note is that, of course, as people have seen the show will know, the events that are take place, it spans a 17-year chronology. So in a way, the story begins in 95 with the Dora Lang murder, when Marty and Russ are called to the scene of the body that they find. And then the show concludes in 2012, and there's a sort of like turning point in 2002. And so the way that the show is structured is in kind of like classic noir styles through voiceovers and recollections of Marty and Russ thinking back in 2012 while they're being interviewed by these other investigators about the events from 95 onward into 2002. And then the show culminates in what happens in real life at the time in 2012. And in some of the early episodes that are focused primarily on what was going on with the initial investigation into the first murder in 95, there's allusions to what people will know as the Satanic Panic from the 1980s. And so the interesting thing about this show as a cultural artifact coming out in 2014 is that it's referencing the real life people called it hysteria, although it really wasn't. It wasn't a panic. It was well founded about ritualistic abuse and child abuse that occurred in the 80s. And then there was a kind of awareness of this with missing children. And you think about like, the Walsh disappearance and all this stuff into the 90s. And then by the time we get into the aughts, a lot of that kind of awareness and consciousness, I think it sort of receded from the public domain. And it was the people who were still engaged in parapolitical analysis and ritualistic occult activity who never lost sight of the fact that some of the things that had bubbled into the surface of the public awareness in the 80s and 90s had been legitimate and that they had continued on. And it wasn't until actually after the release of this show with Pizzagate and then with Epstein that the public kind of caught up and realized, hey, wait a second, we've sort of had this 30, 40-year hangover where we've all sort of collectively forgotten that a lot of these cases that drew national attention back in the 80s and 90s were real and they were genuine. And so what the show had shown in 2014, it was kind of like interestingly poised between what had happened in the 80s and 90s and then what had been forgotten, and then what was shortly revealed right a few years afterwards with Pizzagate and then Epstein. And so I mean, it's open to interpretation about why exactly the show was released. Mm-hmm. But one of the consequences, whether it was intentional or not on the part of HBO and those who were behind it, is that the show actually lent a lot of credence to researchers who for years have been saying that these kinds of things really happen, because of course, right after when the show was released and Pizzagate came out and then Epstein, people could point and say, this is what we're talking about. And so True Detective really is revelation of the method. This isn't just fantasy. This isn't just art. This isn't just imagination. This is really grounded in how the world really works. And so I think for that reason, the show in a way kind of backfired against people who may have put the show out with the intention of sort of refurbishing the idea that these kinds of things were just imaginary, that they were just creative illusions, that there really was only a satanic panic. People who watched the show were kind of inducted into this occult world. And then just a few years after seeing the show, there were these mainstream international headlines with Pizzagate and Epstein showing that, no, actually, this stuff really does occur.
Mm. Yeah, I did want to take a second and analyze something that you said. I was just thinking about it, and it's never occurred to me. And I had thought about the parallels about the initial, like the opening scene of this entire show is the field on fire, and they find a body, and I believe there was an anonymous call or something that was called in or something to report the fire, I believe, and then that's when they discover a body. Now, I don't know to what degree you've delved into the Dutroux case, but in the Dutroux case, I guess you could almost call the heart of the Dutroux case is the Christine Van Hees case. And the reason being is X1 or Regina Loof, like probably the best person to corroborate these claims. She made a bunch of claims that were backed up in the Christina Van Hees case. There was no way she could have known all these details without having been there, kind of deal. And it was some ridiculous amount. The irony is, then they take one or two little examples of something that would be easily misremembered, and they use those as reasons why she was not credible later. But I digress. The point being is, it starts off in that case, in the Christine Van Hees case, it literally was the house, this mushroom farm was on fire, and that they set it on fire after doing essentially, I think it's heavily implied it might be ritual, but some sort of sadistic, rape of a child, and they kill her and leave her there and set the farm on fire, and there's an anonymous call. So that's kind of the initial jump Also, I was thinking, there's also there's a parallel there because the idea of the Christine Van Hees case, the way that played into the Dutroux case, is it was kind of a jumping back in time. So it reminds me of the second case that when they're running into. I forget the name of the second girl. And I believe that's the one who ends up being the girl in the video. But the idea that initially they start this one case and then they dig into this one that seems unrelated and they come to find out it's obviously a huge revelation later. And so obviously there's these parallels here. I mean, the more I dig into it, the more I'm like convinced that this guy was super inspired by Dutroux affair. I struggle to believe he hadn't dug into it. I see too many parallels, but I just want to point that one out because that was the first one from the jump. I know we had wanted to. It sounds like you may have already. If there's any more exposition you want to give on the plot, I just wanted to go into that before I lost that in my head. That I remember that there was that parallel between there. But is there anything more you want to go into the plot before we start dissecting more of this film? Because I know we wanted to lay out the plot a little bit first because. I mean, it's kind of almost necessary to go into that so people have an idea of what exactly we're talking about first. Hey, by the way, spoilers alert. So,
Yeah, I think the name of the girl from the show you're thinking is Olivier is her last name. So I, the way that I think about this show, there's really, I think, three stages to any sort of rational, logical discussion of the show because there's just so much material. It can quickly become, I think, unwieldy to try to digest all of it. So, and just thinking about it myself, this is a season I've watched now probably 7 or 8 times. I rewatched it over the weekend in preparation for tonight, so I have it fresh in my mind. And I was trying to think, how in the world am I going to organize my thoughts to try to get into this? And so, what I thought we might do is just quickly work through episode by episode the plot exposition, so that listeners who either perhaps have never seen the show or at least haven't seen it in some time can really just kind of imbibe the atmosphere of the show. And the thing about noir, right, is that typically the way that it works is that the viewer, in a way, is supposed to identify with the protagonist. One's supposed to become the detective because, of course, one is piecing together the case along with the detectives oneself. So part of what's going on as viewers is that we're trying to figure out what's really going on, but we can also notice things that the detectives themselves overlook. And so there are certain things that Marty and Rust, as great of detectives as they are, and even though they do in a way get to the bottom of much of the case, I think if you pay careful attention to the events across the show, you find out that there's actually really important things that they do overlook. So what I was thinking was just run through the episodes, highlight some of the key events, the characters, certain details that are worth mentioning. I think with an eye to the second part of the discussion, which is how is what's being shown in the show pertain to or parallel a lot of these real life cases? And then the question that follows from there, the third and final question is, then what was the intention behind this show? Like, why would it put so much real information into the show? What's the intention behind releasing this kind of art?
mm,
So let's see. Episode 1. It's called the Long Bright Dark, and as you say, begins with the discovery of a dead woman, 28-year-old prostitute Dora Lang, who's discovered naked, blindfolded, her wrists are bound, and she's posed in a prayerful position on a tree, beneath a tree, and she has stab wounds on her, and she also has what we now know is the FBI confirmed pedo swirl. And again, of course, this isn't news to anybody, but it's important, I think, to mention anyhow. When the show was released, those swirls, so far as I know, were not public record.
mm.
So the pedo swirls and the FBI documentation about these symbols that came out after the show. So whoever was involved in the show somehow had access to that information, and that's a question, to my knowledge, it's never been answered, how
So
exactly
you
those
don't
symbols
think that
were into the
was
show.
so you don't think that was deep lore that we knew that was known by some super in the know at that point? Because I mean, it's hard to say what is known at what point in time. Because I know what you mean. It did become more pervasive in the cultural understanding after Pizzagate. 'Cause that's when the swirl came out, or not came out. It's when it kind of like people started connecting these symbols. But I don't know, I guess you'd probably sounds like you were deeper down the rabbit hole earlier than I was. So I mean, so you're saying you don't think it really was at all. Like, so this would be super deep cut knowledge type deal.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that that symbology, that symbolism, and everybody knows the basics. You know, the
Mhm.
pyramid, the one seeing eye, the 666, all that kind of stuff appears throughout film and television, going many years back, but including I would assume the pedo swirl as well. But what I'm saying is that 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 particular symbol didn't really come into the public awareness until the Pizzagate files. So
Which happened
whoever
after this, yeah.
after that. So whoever
Mhm.
put this in was in the know, is what I'm saying. Because typically the way that this kind of stuff will be explained away, when it starts to look like somebody involved in the production of this kind of work was inserting something from direct knowledge of the occult, or something that wouldn't have just come through cultural osmosis, is namely that, well, they just saw it as a common symbol, it's already circulating. But this symbol really wasn't circulating that so commonly, and it's very important to the show because there's many characters who say specifically, including I think Charlie Lang in one of the episodes when Marty and Russ go to interview him, that it's Reggie Ledoux, who says that that symbol is a sign of the cult that they brand people with, which of course will sound reminiscent of something like from Nexium. So anyway, Dora Lang has this symbol on her body, and one of the sheriffs who's even there says, "Oh, these symbols are satanic," and he says they had a 2020 on it a few years back, and I don't know what the police code is for 2020. I looked it up. Maybe he just meant like they had come across these symbols before and they had noticed them in previous cases. But I thought that was kind of interesting that one of the police at the original scene of the crime mentions having come across these symbols before. And then we get a little bit of character.
Real quick, sorry, I don't want to step on you, but I just looked up just because I was thinking about it, and I don't know if
Mhm,
you're aware. Voodoo Donuts has that exact same, basically the exact same little, spiral triangle symbol.
mhm,
And I
mhm.
just, just because I was curious, I looked it up when they were founded and when the logo was created, and it was 2003. So I found that interesting, and it's weird that the voodoo is seated in a voodoo, obviously that's going to have allusions to what is it the I mean obviously voodoo, but there's a term for it, but essentially the Santeria type stuff. So I mean I would assume maybe it's tied into that symbology, but it definitely obviously has an overt pedophile meaning too. So I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to reach and see if there's any reasoning, but either way, it does seem ahead of its time. So
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
yeah. And even
And
then, the
so
voodoo donuts, that's another rabbit hole some people go down. I don't know, but I mean, even just the
I've never heard
symbolism.
of that. But then of course like the best
Yeah.
of pizza stuff,
Mm.
it's there. So and then we get uh character introduction. So again, this shows a noir, and you might think it's a neo noir because it comes out in 2014, but in some ways, it's actually a classic noir because it doesn't really subvert the genre, the classic genre, in the way that many neo noirs do, particularly in how it handles the archetype of the hero. And so, what you get in effect are two kind of classic archetypes in Rust and Marty. So. Uh, Rust is like the obsessive, right? So this idea in noir that the good guy, the whether he's the private detective or whether he's the police detective, he has problems with authority. Marty even says that in his interview in episode one. Well, guys have to learn how to manage authority. So the idea is that the hero, the archetype, the obsessive is the one who bucks the system, defies authority, runs an end run around the corruption, but he always does so at some kind of great personal cost to himself. Usually, that what ends up happening is he becomes some kind of antisocial, and so that's why, like Rust, he lives in a very Spartan, barren apartment. All he has are like some books, a mattress. At the beginning, he doesn't even have a chair. Right. So he's unmarried. And of course, we learn why, what had happened with the death of his daughter, and so on and so on. So that's one sort of classical noir archetype of the hero. And then you have Marty, his partner, who in a way is another classic noir archetype. And he's kind of like uh, the well-intentioned, generally good-hearted, but sort of fallible
Mhm.
one. And so, in his case, it's alcohol and it's women. And this is kind of blended together in a very nice way because there's a sort of tension in what's running throughout the show, which is this question of everyone's complicity in these most heinous of crimes in terms of the exploitation and abuse of women and children. And so, Marty, he dislikes obviously what's being done to these children, and he wants to protect his own children. But then at the same time, he recognizes that he's far from a saint himself because of his philandering, his womanizing, and his alcoholism. So the show, I think, is one of the major themes in the show philosophically is this question about original sin or sex. And Rust is a nihilist, and he tends to think that, in a sense, existence is a crime. It's almost a crime to exist at all. And this is why he even says explicitly at one point that when his daughter died young, in a way, she unburdened him of what he says is the sin of being a father.
Mhm.
So they get onto this first case, and shortly after being given the case, there's a task force that is formed by Billy Lee Tuttle, who's a prominent pastor or reverend, kind of mega church, sort of Billy Graham, Jerry Falwell sort of type. And Rust and Marty want to get on the case, stay on the case. Rust quickly suspects that there's something suspicious going on with the task force. He doesn't trust it, but they don't have a suspect. So eventually, they end up going to a church revival, and they meet a pastor there, talk to him, and they interview a couple women who give them a description of what they think may be the first description of the potential suspect, which is that he's a tall man with scars, and that he had been hanging around with Dora Lang. They go and they interview Charlie Lang, who is Dora's ex-husband, who's in prison. And Charlie Lang eventually ends up telling them about a guy he knew, Reggie Ledoux, who was his cellmate. And it turns out that Reggie Ledoux had a connection to a second dead body they find. This is the Olivier girl who had gone missing years previously. I think it was like in 1990 or 1992. Her body had been discovered in a flood. But when Russ was going back through the cases, he noticed that there were certain forensic details that matched the description of what had happened to Dora Lang with these stab wounds, and then also the same swirl on her body. So, in fact, what happens is they discover that there have been children going missing for some years. At one point, and it's like episode 3 or 4, when Rust and Marty really start to unravel the case. Rust is going through old cases, and he starts finding a pattern where there's what's are called errors, missing persons made in error reports. And there's these missing children going back to as late as as early as 1979 that he finds out had been reported missing, and then later the files corrected to claim that the missing person report had been made in error. And of course, the key example of this is the Marie Fontenot girl, who had gone missing in, I think it's 1990. And Rust and Marty learn about her disappearance when they're out canvassing, looking for information about who may have known Dora Lang's killer. They find out that this girl, Marie Fontenot, went missing in 1990. And the sheriff, Ted Childress, had claimed that he had interviewed the family, and that the family had said that Marie Fontenot had gone off with her father, but it didn't check out. And so as the story unfolds, what basically ends up being the case is that Marty and Russ discover that whoever killed Dora Lang was also involved in the Marie Fontenot disappearance, was also the one who murdered Olivier, and then also this woman in 2010 at Lake Charles. And so, and then of course, going back into the 80s, in episode 1, Marty and Russ are driving down a road, and there's a billboard for a missing person, a girl named Stacy Gerhardt, who had gone missing in 1987. So there's dozens of these missing children, many of whom disappear without any trace. And it turns out that, of course, that they're being abducted and murdered, sometimes ritualistically. And they hear this from Charlie Lang himself in a later episode. I think it's episode 5, when Charlie confesses that his cellmate, Reggie Ledoux, had said that there was a human sacrifice ring that was abducting children, where rich people would go out into the woods and do this. So they go out to the compound, they track down Reggie Ledoux, and then, of course, there's the really famous shootout where Marty kills Reggie Ledoux after they find the 2 kidnapped children in the compound, the boy and girl. The boy had just died. And so then it appears for a time that maybe the case is solved. They had found their man because they thought it was Reggie Ledoux in 95. But in light of the fact that these other children had gone missing, and had never been accounted for, and that the subsequent murder that happened at Lake Charles later on, they realized, no, whoever killed Dora Lang must still be out there. So when we fast forward to 2012, of course, Rust has stayed on the case, and basically what he figures out is that he was right to suspect in 95 that Billy Lee Tuttle had really been up to no good, because it turns out that Billy Lee Tuttle had a snuff film of the Marie Fontenot murder, and that Marie Fontenot had actually gone to a school which I think is called the Light of the Way Academy in the show, and she had been one of the children who was actually evidently molested at that school. And it turns out that one of the reasons that she was abducted and maybe murdered is because when Rust interviews one of the other children, one of the men who had gone to the school, who's now a male prostitute in the time in 2012, this man has a recollection of having been molested and photographed back at the school with Marie Fontenot, which corresponds to what the preacher at the traveling tent revival, Reverend Terry, had said. He had come across as well back in the 90s when he was working for Tuttle. He had discovered a folder full of images of children that was in possession of one of the Tuttle ministers, and that had been covered up. And of course, that guy, I think his name was Austin Farrar, he later got busted for embezzlement and then died, presumably by suicide, but it's clear that actually Billy Lee Tuttle had him bumped off. So Rust breaks into, I think it's the Shreveport residence of Billy Lee Tuttle's in 2010, discovers this snuff film of Marie Fontenot. So we know that Marie Fontenot, in fact, didn't run off with her father. She was abducted and she was murdered. And then one of the kind of important details about this, as far as police corruption is concerned, is that one of the detectives that we're introduced to in 95, Steve Geraci, who never likes Marty and never likes Rust from the very beginning, well, we figure out why that was the case, because it turns out that back in the 90s, when Marie Fontenot had gone missing, he had been the deputy who took the missing person report on Marie Fontenot. And then what had happened is that Ted Childress, who was the sheriff, had hidden the report, claimed that Marie Fontenot was actually fine, and then given him a promotion to transfer to state CID in Louisiana. So in 95, when Marty and Rust were looking into the Marie Fontenot disappearance, Geraci doesn't come forward and tell them anything because he knows he's complicit in the fact that that had been covered up. So they track down Geraci, who's now the sheriff, I think, of Ibarra. He's been promoted, right? And they basically coerce him into admitting what he had known when they show him the Marie Fontenot snuff film. And that's when we find out that actually the real killer is Childress, who is one of the sons that's from Sam Tuttle, who's the father of Edwin Tuttle, the governor, and then Billy Lee Tuttle. So what happened is that there's actually this secret family that the Tuttle patriarch had, and the serial killer, there's no date of birth for him, there's no social security records, and the only reason they track him down is that, and I think it's episode 2 in 95, when Rust and Marty are scouring and canvassing the neighborhoods, there's this shot where you can see Rust taking a photograph of this little green house. And it turns out that later on they figure out that the green spaghetti monster that one of these children had claimed had been chasing her through the woods is actually the killer, who was a painter. And he had painted the greenhouse, and Marty remembers this greenhouse, so they pull out the photograph, and they realize, oh, if we can figure out who painted this house, we'll track down the killer. So they go through and they get the tax records, and they track down the woman who remembers hiring the company Childress and Son to paint the house, and that's what leads them to Earl Childress, who is the killer, who had been, the secret son of one of the Tuttles. And of course, that's another fantastic illustration of revelation of the method, because we know that these intergenerational satanic covens very often will breed children with no record of their birth so that they can be used for these purposes, whether it's for sacrifices or whatever else it may be. And so that happens to be what's the case with the killer Childress in this show.
Okay. That was a lot, but now that we laid that out for the people, I think that now we have a place to kind of start. I mean, there's a lot to work with there. I mean, is there anything, I guess, for you off the jump that you really want to dig into of that? Because, I mean, there's a lot. I mean, I could pick a random spot and just slice into it, but I don't know. Just if you have any more thoughts, I guess we could easily go into kind of, I guess, let's take a philosophical look at this, too. We just kind of broke down the plot before we get too late in into digging into specific examples, let's kind of look at the philosophy a little bit, because I actually, this was while, I mean, don't get me wrong, I like the revelation and the method stuff here. I think there's something incredibly beautiful about the philosophical arc throughout this story, between both characters, really, and then honestly the juxtaposition of the two. I think there's something particularly beautiful about Rust's changing from being a, I don't know, yeah, he's a nihilist, but then they find some way to, it's almost as if he's found a way within his own lens to find something, I don't know, beneficial, as so far as like a philosophy, a way to look at the world, a way to look at morality, good, bad, stuff like, while still somewhat maintaining his secular worldview. And I'll be honest, I believe you've said, I've listened to your show and you said you're a little bit religious. I'm admittedly an agnostic atheist, whatever you want to call it. So I very much identify with Rust a lot in that way. Although I'm someone who's thought a lot about philosophy in the past. I mean, I don't as much now, so I have kind of worked through those things for myself. I mean, obviously, me and you'd have disagreements probably, but generally speaking, like kind of like the beginning when Rust Cohle is kind of this like angry nihilist of the world. I honestly kind of see that, and I see that as like a foolish version of nihilism. It's like, what kind of way is that to fucking live? Even if you are a nihilist, like, I don't know, might as well have to be this sort of like nihilist that's yeah, maybe there's no cosmic meaning, but I can make meaning for myself, which I think he kind of gets there by the end. I think also you see, I love the progression of Marty and the idea. I think the one line from Rust about like I won't look away again. I think that really that means a lot. I think for Marty's progression more so than it does Rust's progression. I think, the idea that he's starting to open his eyes. He's not content with, and there is something too where you're like, I know some people might think it may detract from your family life or this or that, and you might even say that this thing that he got sucked up in. But if anything, the theme is to open your eyes, and if he had paid attention, if he hadn't looked away, I think he would have been more in touch with his family. Obviously, that not looking away has multiple meanings. It means like looking away from the dark, fucked up things, but sometimes that can just be the monotonous day to day things that you may not pay attention to because you're too busy looking at the dark, fucked up things or whatever. And it's, I guess, finding balance as a man. I don't know. I guess, kind of any thoughts on you? I mean, there's a lot to go with that. I just particularly find it beautiful, the whole juxtaposition of all of it, and then just really the individual arcs as well. It's just beautiful. It's a masterpiece in my opinion.
I have a lot to say about the role of philosophy, particularly the problem of nihilism. So I'll start there. But before I get into that, just so that you can make sure you can refresh my memory when I want to come back to it and I don't forget, you mentioned one thing that I wanted to come to as well, which is this idea of inattention. So at one point, one of the later episodes of the show, Marty says, "Well, I see now that infidelity is one sin, but my true sin was the sin of inattention." And then he had talked about in an earlier episode when he's being again interviewed by these two detectives in 2012 about the detective's curse. And he says that the detective's curse is, you're looking at everything except for the right clues, which are right in front of you. And so just remind me to come to the question of his daughter, Audrey, because I think there's a lot that's going on there with her specific situation that actually shows just how truly expansive this network really is. And then I also want to talk a little bit more about police corruption and some of these other more minor characters and how they kind of try to steer the investigation off the rails. So philosophically, a lot of people have already noticed and commented fairly extensively on the fact that two really important philosophical figures that are looming largely in the show are Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But before I come to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, because in some ways Rust is quoting Schopenhauer almost verbatim, particularly in episode 1, and then his entire theory of time being a flat circle is really very much in Nietzschean doctrine, the idea of the eternal recurrence. So I can talk about that. But then the question is like, well, what is nihilism? And so in everyday parlance, that usually means that like nothing really matters is what we usually mean with that. by that there's really no meaning or ultimate meaning to anything. So you get into this idea of illusion, that somehow the idea that things really matter is an illusion. And you see that kind of bothering Rust. So part of Rust's metaphysics, the Schopenhauerian part about it, is that he thinks that we're all sort of biologically and inherently subject to these kind of delusions or illusions that are necessary for us to get by in everyday life. But the term nihilism is actually coined originally in the 18th century by this now obscure German counter-Enlightenment Christian philosopher named Friedrich Jacobi. And by nihilism, what he meant was he was responding to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And basically what Kant had tried to do was develop this metaphysical system that he thought would preserve the basis to believe justifiably that human beings have freedom, that there is immortality, and that God does exist. Those were the three big ticket items that Kant was interested in preserving. But what Kant thought he had to do was, in order to, as he says, make room for faith, he said, deny that we can know these things. So they become what in Kantian philosophy are called regulative ideas, or postulates of practical reason. The idea is that in order for there to be a moral order, Kant thinks that we have to posit a God who will ultimately be our judge, and that he thinks that in order to hold one another responsible for our actions, we have to posit that human beings are free. And what Jacobi did, in effect, was to say that, well, actually, despite Kant's good intentions, this actually fails, and that this kind of philosophical attempt to justify the idea of immortality, the idea of the existence of God, and the idea of human freedom, it actually backfires, and you end up coming to see that all of this would be an illusion. And so Jacobi basically thinks that once you get the philosophical ball rolling in that direction, you're going to be led to nihilism, which for Jacobi means no immortality, no freedom, no God, which is in a way basically where Rust is at the beginning of the show. But so what Rust does is he kind of takes that nihilistic conclusion that Jacobi had identified, that he thought philosophy led to, and he kind of dressed it up in Schopenhauer's particular metaphysical system. So he says things like in the car with Marty in episode 1, consciousness is a tragic misstep of evolution, that the world is just a gutter in outer space, that we labor under the illusion of having a self, that we think that, in fact, everybody thinks he's somebody when really he's nobody, that really what we should all do is deny our programming, stop reproducing, and opt out of an existence which is a raw deal. And then Marty sort of asks him existentially, right, well, then why do you get up out of bed every morning? And then Russ, kind of like in this moment of kind of like ironic self-awareness, says, well, I tell myself that, like, I have a reason, but really it's because I can't deny my programming. And he says, I lack the constitution for suicide, which is a deeply Schopenhauerian insight, because Schopenhauer basically thought that the entire point of life was to wean yourself from it. And you see this actually in a later episode when, in the montage sequence, Rust is going through all these old case files and he's looking at photographs of dead people. And he tells the detectives in 2012, well, when you look at these photographs of these people, you can notice that the very last nanosecond of their existence, they realized that their entire life had been this drama, that they had been locked up in their own minds, and that everything that they thought mattered was an illusion, including their own self. And so they can let go, and they return to this kind of monistic sense or state of oneness. So Rust is basically a kind of Schopenhauerian nihilist or monist. So he doesn't believe that individuals are individuals. He thinks that in some sense that is an illusion. He thinks that people don't really have free will. And then for that reason, he also thinks that love is an illusion, right? At one point when Marty says, do you think it's possible for a man to love two women at once? Because he's thinking of his wife and then this woman that he's having an affair, his mistress, Lisa. And Russ comes back and says, well, I don't think actually man can even love in the way that he means it. So that's kind of one aspect of Russ' philosophical worldview, is he's a kind of Schopenhauerian nihilist. And then the other component is the Nietzsche. And so that's where you get into the more metaphysical thesis of the eternal recurrence. So Rust at one point talks about the children that are discovered at the Ledoux compound. He says, well, they're going to be in there over and over and over again forever. And he asks the detectives, like, well, how many times do you think we've had this conversation before? So there's almost this kind of like reincarnational metaphysics, the idea that your life as you're living it is something that you've lived many times before, and something that you will live precisely as
It's
you've lived it
determinism. Yeah.
for forever. And
Yeah.
the Nietzschean gloss on this is the idea of amor fati, that you're supposed to somehow will the fact that you're going to be living the same life over and over again. That's the kind of Nietzschean component. And then the little ambiguity, the final side note is that, and this comes out, I think, when Marty and Russ go to the tent revival. There, the disagreement between Marty and Rust over Christianity is partly a question about, well, is Christianity true, or is it a fantasy or an illusion? And then the kind of subsidiary question to that is like, well, does it actually matter if it's true or not? In other words, could it be a good thing even if it is false, right? So there, what's going on is this kind of Nietzschean and Freudian thing, because the classic Freudian conception of an illusion isn't something that's necessarily false per se. It's something that you believe for reasons other than truth. And so that's when you get into the idea of like metaphysical consolation, or the idea of believing a lie because life requires lies. So the early Nietzsche actually thought that what matters in life isn't whether something is true or not. He thinks what matters in life is whether it's life affirming. And so there's a way in which actually Rust is kind of cutting against Nietzsche, because Nietzsche might see Rust as somebody who's still too obsessed with truth. Because Nietzsche thinks that in a way, what you ultimately have to do is even get over the desire for the will to truth. Because Nietzsche thinks what matters isn't finding out what's true or believing what's true, but affirming life. And it could be that actually illusions are useful to that purpose, to making life bearable and tolerable. And so there's a lot of, like I say, different things going on here, the Schopenhauerism and the Nietzscheanism, and it's all sort of blended together in a very interesting way. And of course, there's also Buddhism going on. But then, to come to a kind of conclusion with regard to that issue, by the end of the season, there is some kind of apparent transformation in Rust, where he's not so bleak and cynical and dark as before. He seems to be some kind of optimist. So that's an interesting character arc, certainly in that regard. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's his idea of, as I said, I do think it's weird that he comes to this idea of almost like a secular understanding of, like, I don't know, morality or religion or whatever, because there's so many ways to understand where he comes to at the end. But I mean, I know, I guess the biggest takeaway for me, I don't know, me, someone who's like, I guess, explored some of these ideas, I always found the beginning, while he is a compelling character at the beginning of the show, I do find him to be foolish, because it is like, I am more in the realm of, like, even if, like, I don't know, say something like, a good example would be something along the lines of free will. Like, I actually probably somewhat technically agree with him. I've thought these things through, but it's almost like it's almost like a masturbatory, like, thought process, like, thing when you think about something like free will, because it's like, even if it doesn't exist, you have to behave as though it does exist. So it's like, it's kind of and that's kind of how I look at a lot of these, like, deep questions. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, maybe technically we are just like a biological AI, but it's like, okay, who cares? Like, I mean, at the end of the day, like, I mean, we functionally speaking, it's as if we have free will, so it makes no difference, and you kind of have to hold people responsible. So it makes no meaningful difference really whether we have free will or not. Everything acts the same. So I mean, I know, like, some of the deeper thoughts that he went into, I did find him foolish, but it is like, I guess, as we were talking about, I was thinking about it. If he did have this similar type mindset before having his child, like, let's say he was, agnostic, atheist, or somebody who had to, and he was like that type of nihilist. I forget, there's a term for it that people use, where you're someone who doesn't believe in an ultimate meaning, but you will create your own meaning. And you considering that he lost his wife and child, I think there could be something to that. Like, maybe there's a lesson there in the idea of someone who doesn't have some sort of belief system or higher belief system or something, and then going through some sort of life-altering trauma. Like, what does that do to you? Something that removes your reason, whatever you would have set up as your reason. Because I mean, I'm very much like it's in some ways I'm very much the Marty character, because I have the family, I have a wife, I have kids, like. But I'm also in some ways the Cohle character in, like, that way. But, like, my family's kind of like, is that meaning? So I guess I could kind of also understand if something awful happened to them and they all were gone, how would I come to terms with that as a human being with no actual higher, meaning to me than like raising my children and living a good life type deal. Like, what would that do to a man? And I think that answer might be Rust Cohle.
Well, so one thing I wanted to mention initially when I was going to work through the episodes with the plot exposition, but I just didn't get to it because I was already going to go on for too long as it was, is as far as revelation of the method is concerned, with the character of Rust, there's clear indications that he is a trauma survivor, potentially interfered with psychiatrically through potentially MK Ultra even. And one of the tensions that's going on throughout the show, as people will know who have seen it, is the viewers deliberately led to consider the possibility that Rust himself actually is the murderer, or that he's somehow involved in the ring. And the detectives who are interviewing Marty and Rust in 2012, and then also Maggie, Marty's ex-wife, they eventually, I think it's like in season 5, they just come out and say that they think that actually Rust is the killer and that he's been producing patsies. Now, there's a number of things to say about this. One thing is that it's interesting that on a few occasions, Rust mentions the fact that his dad was a Vietnam War veteran and a sort of survivalist who lived up in Alaska. So he checks the box on that. He comes from a military home. Then there's the fact, and this is mentioned right at the outset, I think in episode 1, maybe episode 2 as well, that Russ comes to Homicide State CID in Louisiana after having previously worked undercover narco for 4 years in Texas. And the reason why he worked undercover for 4 years is that, and this is like familiar territory to anybody who's read the Dave McGowan program To Kill stuff, we know all about this, the Rust shoots somebody, and then so he pleads out to avoid the sentence for the shooting. He ends up working undercover for 4 years, and then he kills some cartel members at the port of Houston, and he has a psychiatric breakdown, and then he's sent to a psychiatric facility in Lubbock, Texas. And then he talks about how, because of his drug addiction that he had when he was working undercover, along with the trauma from the murder, and then the baggage he was carrying already from the fact that his daughter had died when she was very young, he had PTSD and flashbacks and hallucinations. So you have to wonder, though, whether or not actually he's been interfered with by either military or the psychiatric community. And anybody who's read the Tom O'Neill book, Chaos, about the Manson murders, we know that there were intelligence units that were embedded in the police forces, even in the LA Sheriff and LAPD police forces. So Russ talks about, well, my files are sealed and they're all redacted. And so people think I'm a fed. So it looks like, even though in the show, by the end of it, we're supposed to think that Rust actually wasn't really a mind control MK Ultra killer, that he actually is a good guy and he really wasn't the one out committing the murders, finding patsies. It's still consistent with what we're shown, that actually he has amnesia, and these other personalities that he may lapse into, he has no record of, and we're just not shown that. So in the cinematic grammar of the show, it's still actually possible that really there is something else going on with him. And I'll just deduce one sort of example. I'm not saying that I think this is really the case. I'm just saying that it's clearly consistent. It's possible. So as a matter of revelation of the method, Pizzolatto is showing us that people who are embedded in these police forces have intelligence connections. They work undercover. They tend to come from military backgrounds. They have psychiatric records, and so on and so forth. Russ kind of fits all of that profile to a T. But there's the scene where he's speaking to one of the prostitutes. Her name's Lucy the Blonde. He meets her at a trucker bar, and he buys pills from her when he's asking her and the other prostitute about whether they know any Johns who may have been the one responsible for killing Lang. Later on, when he visits her, I think it's like in episode 3, he goes to her apartment to get more pills, and she tries to seduce him, and he rejects her, and she gets angry. And then he stands up, and there's this shot looking up at him, and he says, well, I'm police, so I can do horrible things with impunity. And then it cuts. And this is an early episode where by the time you get midway through the season, you might think back to that scene and say, well, wait, what exactly happened in the apartment with the prostitute? Because unless you think that actually Russ is a good guy and that the detectives who are interviewing him and Marty in 2012 are totally off on the wrong track, and that Rust actually isn't in on all this stuff, you would think, well, what did he exactly do to her? Did he actually kill her? So I'm not saying that in that scene that's actually what happened, but what I'm saying is that I think it's interesting that that scene is put there because it is perfectly consistent with the hypothesis that Rust has amnesia and altered personalities and may not actually himself be aware that the events that were being shown in the show are only following one of his personalities. Perhaps he's off doing other things and we're just never shown it. And it could be that actually there's other stuff going on with
There's
him. But
alters, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
even with the perspective we're given, he's not a reliable perspective. And I was thinking about, as you said, I was like, well, I mean, when they show it from his perspective, I think a lot of times you could make the case that maybe it was a third person perspective when they show him. But I don't know. I think there were times where they're definitely showing that it's supposed to be from his perspective, because one of the things about his, he sees things that aren't there sometimes, and we see it too. So that would denote that we're seeing it from his perspective. So the point being is he's not a reliable. So in those instances, he's not a reliable narrator or whatever the situation. So you can kind of take leeway of, if you have some case, if it's backed up by some instance of when we only see his POV, you may want to hold it in doubt. So yeah, and I just thought, as you said, I was thinking that that would actually kind of add to that, because I think the only things that would push back against that would be instances of his story where you're seeing things from his perspective, and you're like, well, he's not a useful narrator.
Exactly. That the whole point is what is the story? As you know, we're getting memories from Marty. We're getting memories from Maggie. These are people's recollections of 95, of 2002. So it's selective just in that regard that we're only seeing so many people's perspectives. So what about all the other people who are involved that we don't hear from, for one? But then, yeah, in the case of Rust in particular, how do we know that he has complete access to his own memory?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And in fact, this is also something that the character's name is Toby Belair. He's the male prostitute in New Orleans that Russ tracks down toward the end. I think it's episode 7. He's the one who had been the
His
classmate.
memories were jumbled too. Yeah.
And he says, well, I just told myself that it was a dream. Right. And so everybody who's delved into this realm understands that one of the common consequences of that kind of trauma and abuse, whether it occurs in childhood through ritualistic sexual abuse or whether it occurs later on through more like MK Ultra, military intelligence, psychiatric interference, is the amnesia. So it's entirely possible that Russ has missing memories. And that brings me, though, also, before I forget, to the issue of Audrey. So there was a time where, having watched this season, I was convinced that actually Maggie may be part of the cult. And I'm still open to the idea that she knows more about what's really going on than what most people who watch the show think.
It would make some of her extreme decisions make more sense. Because I will say, watching that was one of the things that even me, like, I get sort of, you're like, oh, this sort of, it still seemed too dramatic for her character, some of the actions she took. But
Well,
I
yeah.
don't know.
So
it could be a woman
which
snapping. I meant like her fucking Russ, basically, her sleeping with Russ. Like, I mean, like, don't get me wrong. Like, I get it, the drama, like, but it seemed, and I've heard you speak on some other show where, like, the idea being like she needed to do something to throw him off the, like, that would make sense. Whereas, I mean, don't get me wrong, I get it. She's a wife spurned. She knows he's cheating again, like, blah blah. But like, it didn't seem to fit to her character, in my opinion. It seemed too extreme. So.
Yeah. So okay. So that was the kind of hypothesis. Yeah, I had thrown out in the discussion I did with the PsyOp Cinema guys. That was kind of my read at the time. Watching it again, I'm less confident on that specific claim, although I still think it could be the case. So just to kind of backtrack through the whole Maggie arc, because it comes to the question of Audrey, and then also like the pervasiveness of this cult. Like, where is it? And it's everywhere. That's even what Russ says right toward the, like, episode 7, when he's talking to Leroy Salter, the really corrupt major, who I think actually is part of the cult. And I have a reason for thinking that. I could mention that as well. But Russ says, well, it's like alligators in a swamp, and they're everywhere. And one of the things that we come to figure out, right, is that Dora Lang was abused as a child. Marie Fontenot was abused as a child. This all occurred in the school environment. So this is McMartin. This is like the charitable organizations with Sandusky. So if it's being done by people who have access to children in a school environment, that's the whole point behind the Tuttle schools, is that they were creating these schools as places to get access to the children, then who's to say that people who are part of that cult didn't have access to Audrey? And the
I'd be
reason,
interested to think if we looked back, if we'd be able to see any details that tell us what school they went to, because those were Christian schools. There's a religious component. So I'm wondering. I mean, I feel like that'd be too on the nose, and Marty probably would have had to have picked up on that if that were the case later.
well,
But
that's what I'm saying.
yeah,
So yeah, that's the kind of like thing, and but I think that's an assumption, right? That these
yeah,
guys make. So I had said at the outset, like they figure out a lot, but there's also things I think that we're in a position to figure out that they don't. And this could be one of those cases where they are focusing on the Tuttle schools, which
mm,
were breeding grounds for this abuse. But what's to say that the cult isn't operating just outside of those
yeah.
charter schools as well? And the reason I say this is that everybody talks about the scene. I think it's even in episode 1 or 2 where Audrey and Macy are playing in the room, and Marty goes to call them to dinner, and they have the female doll who's lying naked on her back, encircled by a group of men, which it's very much akin to the kind of ritualistic stuff that we see later with the Fontenot tape. So where did Audrey get the idea? Now the point is that Marty doesn't initially ask her about that. It's Maggie who later prompts him to do this when she then goes and draws some inappropriate drawings at school of like couples having sex. And when Marty asks Audrey, well, where did you get that idea from? It's very interesting, but if you pay attention, Audrey avoids answering that question. What she answers is the question, well, why she drew it was that she says, well, the girls in the class like thought it would be funny. But she never tells Marty or Maggie where the idea came from. So, and then when Audrey, when she's 16, when we fast forward to 2002 and she's caught having sex with the two boys, the 20-year-old and 19-year-old boy in the car,
I think
she
her aesthetics, I think, are important there too, because she's very gothy. It's reminiscent of the conversation with the grandpa from earlier.
yep.
We're like, all these kids these
Yeah,
days,
yeah, yeah.
like
Yeah, and then
that's
also
yeah.
so then in 2012 when Marty goes to visit Maggie and Maggie gives Marty the update on how Audrey's doing, she also says, well, she's an artist. And it's also very well known that people who are trauma survivors, abuse survivors, very often will find creative outlets to deal with that. So she's also an
Pizzagate.
artist.
You're thinking Pizzagate right now. You're
Yeah.
thinking Pizzagate. The one
So
girl,
so so
but
my
connected to Podesta, the one lady who does all the art. I don't know if you've ever seen that. There's
Abramovic.
and I don't think it's Abramovich. I think it's somebody else. There's somebody else who does those weird warped ones with the creepy looking dead faced
Oh
children.
yeah. I don't
Yeah,
know the
that
name
one.
of the
Yeah,
artist.
but she apparently is. I believe that's the one. What Podesta's brother has a whole series of art. I guess supposedly of this chick, and supposedly I believe she even said this was like working through trauma or something or for her. So it's like I mean, let's be real. She probably is some sort of trauma person from that exact network. So,
Yeah,
but yeah,
so my hypothesis is that actually when Marty talks about the detective's curse, even by the end of the show, he never figures out that Audrey herself was a victim of the cult that he had been investigating the entire time. Um, because she has all the symptoms of someone who was abused. So that's my read on it. So then the question
yeah,
becomes, well, then what's Maggie's role in it? And so I've softened a little bit on her because at first I thought, well, she was like more like a Nicole Kidman character from Eyes Wide Shut and knew everything. And so I had thought, well, in 2002 when she slept with Russ, this was done deliberately to sabotage the investigation. Because if you think about it, at that point, what was going on is that Russ was onto the fact that they had never caught the real killer. And so I have been thinking, well, if Maggie knew that and she didn't want Russ to go digging back into the case, then she knew the best way to stop the investigation would be to break apart the friendship between Marty and Rust. I now don't think that's necessarily why she did it, but what I do think is that she knows more than she lets on because in 2012, when Marty goes to see her, everybody who watches the show notices that she's kind of leveled up socially, as it were. So she marries this guy whose last name is Sawyer. We never see him or meet him or know much about who he exactly is, but it's clear from her house that he's very wealthy. So we know that he's part of now the Louisiana wealth and elite that would be part of this milieu that goes up to the Tuttles and that goes up to the kind of people that Marty and Russ were
yeah.
investigating back in
And then her
95.
father obviously was well to do as well, which I think
Exactly.
it's heavily implied. Perhaps I think there's something poetic about the the conversation he had with him, and if you do think about that and juxtapose it with the idea that possibly he's someone in the doing these sort of awful things, it would be kind of this warped perspective where you kind of get to see from the perspective of the abusers here, to where it's almost like there's this hierarchy of we're above this. You guys need to fall in line. There used to be better days where people knew their place. Blah 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 blah. It's almost that kind of feeling. I mean, don't get me wrong. I guess maybe the show makes you want to hate him though, so I guess it's almost the obvious one if there is a character. Although this is one that little lark that the show went on wasn't really an obvious tangent to begin with. So it is like it is one of those ones that we really don't know. It's
Well,
yeah. I
so
mean,
the thing with the grandfather, Marty's father-in-law, is when they go to the house to visit, one of the first things that the grandfather asks Marty is, "Well, how's the case going?" And this
mm,
happens, like Maggie will ask too, like, "Well, how's the case going?" And it's kind of odd. It's like, "Are you checking in? Like, what's really going on there, bro?" Right? And so I noticed that when Marty talks to Maggie in 2012, and I don't think this can be coincidental. It had to be put there, I think, for a reason. She's sitting in a chair, and to her right is a photograph, presumably of her new husband, and they're standing at some sort of tourist attraction. I don't know whether it's like Egypt or whatever, in front of a pyramid. And so you get the pyramid symbolism right there in the frame with the husband standing in front of this like classic occultic um, scenario. So I think what happens to Maggie, in effect, is what you were saying was true about Marty at the beginning, which is that she turns a blind eye to this kind of stuff. And I think that's also why by the time she's interviewed in 2012 by the other detectives, she's kind of aloof and she's cold and she's bitter and she's cynical. But I don't think that's just because of like what had happened with Marty. I think it's because she figured out that whatever it was that Marty and Rust were digging into in 95 is everywhere, and it potentially implicates even her new husband. And so she's just kind of decided that in order to cope with the scope of all this, she's just going to not look into it. And the final thing I'll say about when it comes to police corruption and some of these more minor characters that tend to get overlooked, who are, I think, really essential to figuring out the dynamics of how this whole cover up works, is that there's a series of majors throughout the progression from 95 to 2012. The first major is Casada. He's just kind of like, a company man. He's not pernicious. He just wants to keep his bosses happy. But then when we come to 2002, before when Rust resigns or quits, the new major is this guy named Leroy Salter, and he's clearly corrupt. I think he knows all exactly what's going on because he starts gaslighting Russ. So he says, "Well, I'm going to have you for mental exhaustion." He writes up a report where he says that Rust is manic. So he's deliberately trying to attack Rust's reliability by claiming that he's mentally ill. And he slips up because in one of the scenes when Salter is grilling Rust and Marty, telling them that they're not going to be allowed to look into any of these missing persons, well, one of the guys who's there is Commander Speece, who's the one who wears the blue uniform. He was there all the way in 95. Speece is the guy who accompanies Tuttle when they introduce the task force. And Speece, to me, is part of the cult also, because he has the evil eye on Marty and Cole the entire time. And it's Speece who tells Cole, after Cole had gone to confront Tuttle, he says, well, Cole says, "I didn't brace him," or something. And he says, "Well, it's not for you to decide what kind of conversation it is." So it's clear that Speece is taking orders from the cult from the beginning, because he's the one who basically wants to take the case off the hands of Marty and Rust all the way back in 95 with the task force. And then in 2002, he's the one there who's basically enjoying the fact that Salter is stonewalling and driving Rust to a point of frustration where he's just going to leave the department altogether. But Salter says to Rust during one of these confrontations, he says, "Oh, well, what do you want us to do? Put out like an APB or something like on all missing persons within a 10-mile radius of Walmart, and like look, we're going to go after Sam Walmart." Well, in the episode that comes later, when Rust takes Marty to the storage shed to show him all of his evidence, including the Fontenot snuff tape, it turns out that Rust had shown that all these disappearances occur within a 10-mile radius of the charter schools, the Tuttle schools. And I don't think it's coincidental that it's 10 miles. So I think what happened in effect is that Salter knew that these disappearances were localized within a 10-mile radius, but he just changed the location to mock it. So rather than saying, well, let's look at a 10-mile radius within all these Tuttle schools, he tried to kind of gaslight Rust and make a joke of it by saying, oh, well, why don't we look within a 10-mile radius of all the Walmarts? So he clearly, I think, knew what was going on.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm trying to think if there's. You let me know. Is there any specific spots you really want to analyze before we go into the third part of this, where we kind of go into the why of the revelation of the method? I think we could probably spend quite a bit of time going through anecdotal examples. It's kind of hard to prevent yourself doing it, but it's almost. I don't know. There's so many different spots you can pick and be like, oh, this is just like this thing, this is just like that thing. So I don't know if there's anything along those lines you want to go into before we move into the next part, which is kind of theories on how this even got made, why it got made. But I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that to kind of to support that before we get to that last act. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, so just, I mean, by way of summary, some of the key aspects or components of revelation of the method in this show, so far as I can see it, one would be the police corruption that we're discussing. The idea of the command structure being a mechanism by which they derail these investigations. And that's even what Geraci says on the fishing boat. He says, well, when Childress told me not to look into the Fontenot disappearance, what was I supposed to do? It's the chain of command, right? I was following chain of command. That's how it works. So there's the police corruption and the idea that the cult infiltrates the police and law enforcement and the judicial system and basically weaponizes the command structure to shut down all these investigations through the chain of command. That's one thing. The other related thing, which I didn't really come to, is this issue about blackmail and extortion and compromise, because of course that comes to the surface with regard to the Tuttle being in possession of the Fontenot snuff film. Rust himself is the one who says, well, he was probably bumped off by other people in the cult because he became a liability when they figured out that the snuff film that he had been in possession of was lost. So the show already openly talks about the idea of there being blackmail and extortion.
Yeah,
One
and snuff
interesting,
films.
yeah,
Sorry.
but one thing that a friend of mine, Brett Carollo from Psyop Cinema, drew to my attention is he was telling me that apparently in the Red Hot Chili Peppers biography, Anthony Kiedis's biography, it's called Scar Tissue. Apparently, there's some kind of incident that's recounted in there of a woman who's a sex operative who is the daughter of a Louisiana chief of police. So what I wanted to say here is that when it comes to the world of extortion and blackmail and compromise, um, look at Marty. He has a penchant for philandering, right? So the woman, the mistress that he has in 95, Lisa, the court stenographer, the
Hmm.
way it's depicted is that when he scorns her, she, out of revenge, tells Maggie about the affair. But what I'm saying is that when we know how the world really works, it turns out that some of these women are sex operatives. So another aspect of what's going on with the corruption and the command structure is that through also sex operatives like a woman like Lisa or like Beth, who he reunites with later at the T-Mobile shop after he had first, met her as a young girl at the Bunny Ranch. This is what we saw with Epstein, with like Ghislaine Maxwell and these other people. So a lot of the extortion and the blackmail is done through intelligence services, through honeypots, through sex operatives, and this is also how they maintain the corruption in the law enforcement. Is that if you're a genuinely good guy and they don't have leverage over you because you don't have a drug addiction, you don't have an alcohol addiction, you don't have gambling debts, you're not a closeted homosexual, you're not cheating on your spouse or whatever, they can't control you, right? So then what happens is they do in effect what they did to Russ, which is they drive you out or they don't promote you. And so all they're going to do is promote the people who are either corrupt, like Geraci, or people who happen to actually be from the cult itself. So the other example here is the guard from the prison who is a Childress, who basically tells the guy Francis, who was going to divulge all this information about the Yellow King, to kill himself. So the other aspect is that another aspect of the revelation of the method, I mean to say, is that in addition to the world of blackmail and extortion and MK Ultra stuff, you also have the sex operative angle. I think that's in there. And then the final bit is that the ritualistic component of all of this, the Santeria, the Satanism, it's also controlled through the occult. The command structure is incest, intergenerational incest. So that's the case, obviously, with Childress himself, who is the son from one of the Tuttles. But it's also true, it appears to be, of Dora Lang herself, because actually, if you recall one of the early episodes when Marty and Russ go to interview Dora Lang's, I think it's grandmother, there's a photograph that they look at of a young girl who's standing in front of these men who are on horseback with masks on. And when you look at the photograph initially at the episode, you think maybe they're KKK people, but then you realize, no, actually, they're wearing the same Mardi Gras stuff that later on comes to be affiliated with all the Santeria voodoo stuff that they hear was going on at the Tuttle property from Dolores, the maid. So it appears, what I'm saying is that actually Lang herself probably came from one of these intergenerational abusive, incestuous families as well.
There's one thing I want to point there. There was some Geraci, I think is his name.
Yeah.
That guy. I feel like he's a worthwhile thing just to look at, to examine, because one of the things I think people will be, if we try to talk to normies about something along these lines, they'll be like, well, how does this even happen? I think Geraci's a good example because it's very clear through the interaction with him that he didn't know. And really, he could have very easily have been, that could have been Marty. That really could have been the Marty character. That could have happened to Marty. I'd like to think that maybe Marty would probably be a slightly better character and it probably wouldn't happen to him. But really, it is just kind of the inattentiveness is really what, kind of the issue is here. I guess that's kind of almost a theme throughout. Because even with, somebody like a Geraci, it really is just kind of okay, whatever, I'll take your word for it. Like, I'm sure he just didn't ask more questions. Maybe he thought something was weird, but it's like, hey, boss is saying this. Okay, who am I to question it? You just kind of you forget about it, and you just assume everything's good and move on with life and just make that assumption and don't check, even though there's that little voice in the back of your head that's saying, I don't know, maybe I should dot my I, cross my T. That's kind of that. Obviously, that plays into I think a lot of characters here. And so I think maybe that was almost I think that definitely was a theme he was trying to make, and I think that I do think that kind of is expressed through to Cole's little, I won't look away again. I think that's that one little line that expresses it there, and it's kind of has another side of it too than just something inattentiveness. Although I guess even something as crazy as like looking as wanting to look deeper into things like SRA, like satanic ritual abuse and stuff like that. I guess that kind of is like a shedding off inattentiveness. So. Because it is kind of like, I know this stuff happens, and I think we need to be aware of it. So, all right, let's get into the last portion here. You seems like you have some thoughts on why this was made, how this was made, just kind of thoughts within that realm. I'm kind of interested to hear what you have cooked up, because I haven't really looked too much into like the people who made this. I've looked a little bit into the writer. I know he's the one who wrote season 1, 2, 3, I think, and I think that's it. And then 4 is like a new writer. I don't know enough. I've heard people. I don't know the source of it. I've heard people say he was inspired by the. I can't think of it. It was a church scandal. It was the Hosanna church scandal. I haven't heard anything else that he was particularly inspired by. I'm convinced, like 100%, he was inspired by Dutroux Affair. It just seems way too close. But obviously, there's a lot of other things he was inspired by. Just kind of. I don't know. What are your thoughts about why, how, why? I don't really know. This to me blew me away. This was even made. I struggled to find an angle. Even if the things that happen, like Pizzagate, didn't happen shortly after, even absent all those things, it's still kind of wild. I'm just blown away. This was even allowed to happen. So I don't know. Was there some sort of angle you think that somehow the powers that be were just like, oh, this won't be so explosive? Or what? I struggle to wrap my head around the angle. It almost just seems like this one just slipped through. I don't know. Thoughts?
I have a number of thoughts about this. The first thing to say is that I don't want to presume to be in a position to know what any particular person's intentions were in making it, including Pizzolatto. So the analysis that I'm going to offer is deliberately just going to bracket any sort of speculation about any one particular person's motivations for making this, because I think you can still come to a considered view about how it was made and why, with a degree of intention or a gentleness behind it, without having to say, well, this person was doing it for this reason, this person was doing it for that reason. We just don't know that. So with that out of the way, my view is that this is a classic case of revelation of the method. And in my view, that's a form of it's a form of psychological warfare, particularly what I call a form of demoralization. And this is a topic that I've explored, particularly with reference to film noir. And you think here of a film like 1974's Chinatown by Roman Polanski. And Chinatown, in some ways, is very much a sort of guidepost for this film as well. Because if you think about it, the sort of infamous conclusion to Chinatown is that Jake Gittes, the Jack Nicholson character, is essentially finds himself in a situation where he is forced to see the futility of knowing that everything he's done has been pointless because the evil in Los Angeles is so pervasive and so powerful that there's nothing he can do to stop it. And so, in that regard, I call Chinatown a piece of demoralization, because I think what Polanski was doing in the 70s was trying to accustom the audience to become apathetic to this kind of real world corruption by basically coming to see that if the events that are shown in a movie like Chinatown are truly representative of how the world really works, then what am I ever going to do about it? And so the idea is that uh, these kinds of films and TV shows acclimate the audience to a level of corruption and immorality and evil that we just eventually take to be beyond our control. And this comes out at the very end of True Detective, because when Marty and Rust are talking to one another in the hospital room after Rust has woken up from his coma, one of the first things he says to Marty is, "Well, we didn't get them all." And then Marty says, "Well, we didn't get them all, but that," he says, "that's just how it is in this kind of world." So it's a matter of interpretation. Do you spin it positively and say,
Mm-hmm.
well, okay, he's being a realist, but still in a way optimistic because we did get some of them and we should be happy about that? Or is this really actually a way of trying to condition people to accept the fact that we live in a world where these kind of people do get away? And so, I mean, if you think about Dutroux, no one other than Dutroux was ever arrested and
Mm-hmm.
prosecuted. And there was a string of murders. I think it's like 20 people related to the case who died in mysterious circumstances. It was a
Yeah.
complete
Dutroux was just
cover
a
up.
handyman slash kidnapper. That's all he
Yeah,
really was. Yeah.
same thing with Sandusky at Penn State, right? It's the same thing with the Finders Code. It's the same thing with Presidio. No prosecutions there. Michael Aquino and everybody he was working with got away. It's the same thing at the West Point Children's Hospital. Rudy Giuliani, evidently, according to Dave McGowan, came in and actually led the DOJ team that covered that one up. No one was arrested there. Epstein. I mean, well, whatever happened to that? I mean, I rail about this all the time.
The Epstein files are coming though.
Well, that's the point. And so you talk about like managed
Yeah.
expectations, right? So now they have the public 6 years on after he was arrested thinking, well, success means getting the names of the people who did this. What about the arrests,
Yeah.
right? So what I'm saying is, True Detective, it, the question is,
Managing
what
expectations.
yeah, what are we gaining by watching it? So I can watch this show where these two guys are supposed to be heroes. They get to the bottom of everything, but then what happens in real life? Nothing. So, for example, McConaughey is like friends with the Clintons, but we know
Mm.
all about the Clintons and their involvement in Haiti and all the kinds of stuff the Clintons were involved in, going back to Arkansas,
Isn't
Mena,
Harrelson's
Arkansas.
dad like a Fed or some shit? Something
He was
crazy?
a
Like a
reportedly
hitman or
a hitman.
something?
Yeah.
Yeah, something
So I
crazy.
guess what I'm saying is like my view is I'm cynical is that, like, for example, if Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson were genuinely serious about getting to the bottom of these kinds of things, and they really were bothered by the fact that these kinds of things happen in real life, then why would they just shoot a show 11 years ago and then just more or less move on with their lives and act like all the kinds of things that were shown in the show aren't still really happening? Why would HBO allow for the show to be released? So I think we have to, think critically, suspiciously about what is really the function of this show, showing us all this stuff about how the world really works. And because of course the point is that a lot of times those of us who do this kind of research, we think we're winning by exposing them.
Mm.
And it could be that we expose certain things that they don't want exposed at a certain time, or that we expose maybe more than they would like. But they're in a way the masters of exposure. That's the whole idea behind revelation of the method, is that they're showing us things that we as researchers might naively think we're winning by exposing. They willfully expose it. My final thought about it, what's really going on, is that spiritually, Um, Russ talks about, the psychosphere and the atmosphere, and everyone marvels about how the season is very atmospheric and very moody, and that's true. And Rust and some of the other characters talk about how they can feel the pervasiveness of the cult. That, like as Russ said, that they're like alligators swimming in a swamp, and they could be anywhere. So there's a what you could call an omnipotence fantasy, I think, that's going on in the minds of these people who are involved in this kind of occult, satanic corruption, where they deliberately like to project that degree of power. This is exactly what Michael Hoffman says in his famous book that kind of really popularized the term revelation of the method, is that there's a kind of power that they gain by deliberately allowing the public to know that this cult does exist, but then people are left in a situation where we feel like there's nothing we can do about it. And so I think that True Detective, being released in 2014, was this sort of exercise in sort of occult revelation of the method, where these people who are in the know, who are really engaged in this kind of stuff, decided to project that power by deliberately putting out a very kind of rich, detailed account of how this all works. And this moment where, as I had said at the very outset of tonight's discussion, people like us who are aware of the parapolitical world and the world of occult trauma and sexual satanic ritual abuse and intelligence operations, we know about all these cases from the 80s and 90s. But the average viewer who's looking at this as just a piece of innocent HBO entertainment, they've associated all the stuff that they're going to be seeing in the show with the quote so-called satanic panic. And so then what happens is the blurring between reality and entertainment is such that when someone like that views the episodes, they go, oh, well, the show is making reference to how things felt in the 90s, coming out of the so-called satanic panic. And in the world of the show, we're being shown that this kind of stuff really does happen. But of course, this is just a show, right? So there's this like bifurcation where the average person watching the show says, well, the show is referencing the fact that there was this apparent awareness in the 80s in real life that these things happened. But in the world of the show, we're shown that, yes, they do really happen, but this is just a show. So ergo, they don't actually really happen. But of course, as we know, they do. So I think there's this kind of feedback loop where the interaction between real life stories and their depiction in cinema and television starts confusing people about what really is actual and what really isn't. But the overall kind of spiritual motivation behind, in my view, why they do this is that it's ultimately, I think, designed to just get people to settle for less. The idea that, as Marty says, well, we can't get them all. This is just the kind of world that it is. So it's ultimately, I think, about getting us to resign ourselves to the fact that we shouldn't care. We shouldn't look into it. We should look away, because what's the point in looking into it? You're just going to end up like, get us at the end of Chinatown. There's no point.
Yeah, I think there's something to that, but I think that there with all things in life, I think perspective matters, and I think kind of what we're describing when we're talking about revelation and the method is kind of essentially is a a limited hangout, essentially, in a certain sense. It's a seeding of the narrative ground by the powers that be. They're for whatever reason it is, they feel they need to do exposure in whatever given thing and whatever given example we're looking at the time. It's almost like a letting off of the relief valve. So just a simple idea that they're doing it, I think, is you can look at it as like this is a good thing. Obviously, they're trying to seed a different spot in the narrative game, and they're trying to dig their heels in there. But hey, whatever, it's a slippage on their part, and so that's one way to look at it. And I think even in the particular of the show, maybe you're right. Maybe there is the idea was from certain powers that this was to resign us to complacency of like, oh, there's nothing we can do. But I would argue that the theme and the major themes of this story kind of buck against that. Obviously, we just mentioned at the very end they go, oh, we can't get them all, and then we just. But I think most people even agree when that happens. You feel bizarre. That feels bizarre. This feels not right. It doesn't feel like it fits. It doesn't seem to fit the characters. I mean, it fits Marty. I mean, although that kind of doesn't fit his character arc, like, because I think by the end of his arc, the idea is that this would no longer be something. He's no longer supposed to be complacent. He's no longer supposed to be this person. So I don't think it fits, and I think the theme and the idea of like I won't look away again, or the lack being attentive, paying attention to what matters. I think all of those are themes that buck against it. So I would like to think that I don't know whether it's the writer himself or other people within it. Somehow, I think they found a way to put their spin on it, while also maybe doing the revelation, the method. So it's almost like they snuck in a secret meaning into the art that I think. I don't know. I think it matters, and I think if people pay attention and analyze the show, they can get that from it, and we can kind of get something positive out of it instead of something negative, regardless of how it was designed to be put out or what the intent of it was. So. But with that, Stephen, I think this has been a great episode. I really enjoyed it. I'd be happy to have you on again. But with that, let people know where they can find you. If you got anything you're working on, any books, any projects, whatever. I think you said you had a book you were just wrote or something along those lines. Now would be a good time to let my audience know about it.
Yeah. As I said, I've been working on film noir recently. I have a serial that's being printed in cultural engineering studies. The first issue came out last year. It's now available in a limited print run. It's a 3-part series. First 2 parts focus primarily on Chinatown. Issue 2 will be coming out in April. And then the third part of the essay will be focusing on Year of the Dragon, and then in a classic noir film called Where the Sidewalk Ends. That will be put up on the Decoding Culture Foundation website. That's the foundation that runs the magazine. It's all run by the guys at PsyOp Cinema, Brett and Thomas. So I highly encourage everybody to go check out Cultural Engineering Studies. It's a really fantastic magazine with a ton of really great researchers who did good work for it. Jason Horsley, Jay Dyer, Jamie Hanshaw, the Collins brothers. So I've been working on film noir stuff. And I have a monograph that will be out hopefully this year, a philosophy monograph. But all my books, you can find them at my publishers. You can also find them on my website, stephendelay.com. And then I maintain a Twitter account, sort of minor, small account, but I could always be reached there as well. So.
All right, well, appreciate you coming on the show. With that, for those who want to support the show, you can do that without any money. If you want to like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, that stuff helps out a lot. If you're listening to this on audio, please go leave a 5-star review. That helps. But if you really want to support the show, cash is king, baby. Patreon.com/NoWayJose2020 is a way to do that. The lowest level is, that's where you get the early access to episodes like this. I'm trying to crank up to where I'm doing like 2 a week now. So patrons will get 2 now a week, and it'll be even longer behind the paywall. So basically like 2 weeks behind the paywall. Also, you guys can get the ad-free RSS feed there. Also, you can be a talking head on me and Austin's Already Dead show that we do on Tuesdays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, the call-in show. The highest level also is my sponsors. I read them off every episode as a thanks to you guys. My co-host and Targeting at Targeting Toad, also have at ApplegateDeeds, at COVRECK, at _Infinite Zeal, Tim Tuttle, at Jolly on Klebold, Will Bell's Delicious Blueberry Rabbit Eye Wine, then Big Fan of the Show, Torn May, and then at INWARDLOVER. Make sure follow me on Twitter at Targeting Jose. Appreciate you guys, support the show, helping us do what we do over here. And with that, we are out of here. Bye-bye.